This video will explore the land rights movement and Indigenous claims to the land of Australia. Captain Cook described Australia as terra nullius, or the land belonging to no one. This falsehood was propagated for almost 200 years. So what are land rights? We know that Indigenous Australians were displaced from the land on which they lived by European settlers, and often became slaves to the new settlers. The land rights movement therefore protested against the refusal to give land rights to Aboriginal people, but also argued for a fair economy, which incorporates fair payment for Aboriginal workers. One of the aims of the movement was to make Aboriginal people independent and not reliant upon government support. However, land is important to Indigenous people not just for survival, but also for spiritual reasons. The land has a central role in Aboriginal spirituality. The issue of ownership of the land has been ongoing since the Europeans began to settle in Australia in the late 18th century. The land rights movement, as we know it, began in 1966. It was a reaction against the mining that occurred in the early 1960s on Aboriginal land, without the support of, or any consultation with, the Indigenous owners of the land. In August 1966, 200 Aboriginals of the Gurindji people walked off Wave Hill Pastoral Station in the Northern Territory in protest over the amount they were paid. This encouraged a rethink about the traditional owners of the land and sparked the land rights movement. The basis upon which the European settlers claimed the land was that it was uninhabited. This is a reflection of their understanding of the Indigenous people as less than human, and therefore not worthy of consideration. In the 1970s, the Indigenous populations became more politically active, and the movement for land rights grew stronger. One early case in 1971 in the Northern Territory went against the Aboriginal landowners on the claim of terra nullius, or nobody's land, which meant that it was there for the taking. However, the Judge Justice Richard Blackburn did recognise that the land had been in use by the Indigenous people. On Australia Day in 1972, a group of tents appeared outside Parliament House in Canberra. This Aboriginal tent embassy helped to bring attention to the issue of land rights. Over this embassy was flown the flag which has come to represent Indigenous Australians. The Northern Territory made the first significant move in transferring land rights to the Aboriginal people if they could provide evidence of their association with the land. With the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976, around 50% of land in the state was transferred to its Indigenous owners. South Australia followed the example of the Northern Territory in 1981 in allowing the land to be transferred to its traditional Indigenous owners. 10% of the state's land was transferred back to its traditional holders. However, not all Indigenous communities were so lucky. Those that came up against the mining industry in the 1980s were denied the right to prevent mining. It was not until 1992 that the idea of terra nullius, no one's land, was revoked by the High Court of Australia. This was more than 200 years after the arrival of the First Fleet. In 1993, the Native Title Act allowed Indigenous people to claim vacant land owned by the government if a connection to the land before 1788 could be proven, which, as you can imagine, is quite difficult to do. Land owned by individuals could not be claimed. Therefore, only a small percentage of land could be claimed back. In 1995, the federal government set up the Indigenous Land Corporation to support Indigenous Australians in acquiring and managing land. Whilst much land has been returned to its traditional owners, many believe that there remains a long way to go to allow all Indigenous Australians to take full control of their traditional land. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy remains in Canberra 40 years on from its first appearance, and campaigners continue to highlight injustices suffered by Indigenous communities.